All right, it is 6 o'clock and we have a lot to cover tonight. So I'd like to call the meeting to order. We have a quorum here. Welcome everybody to our September Climate Action Planning Committee meeting. So glad you all could make it. An agenda was circulated, and so we'll be spending much of our time tonight talking with folks from Apex about the emissions inventory. Are they on the call yet?
Emily from Apex just joined us.
Perfect. Okay. And then we'll also cover our research agenda and then talk about any proposals that we have for town funding and have public comments at the end. Are there any additional agenda items that we need to include? Okay, hearing none, our first item is to review and approve the meeting minutes from our last meeting. Those were distributed before. Did anyone have any corrections to the meeting minutes from August? Talking about the meeting minutes, and I haven't heard any corrections, so no, I'm good. No, okay. Is there a motion to approve the minutes? Okay. Is there a second? Wonderful. All right. My understanding is that we need to do a roll call vote when we're having a hybrid meeting. So I'm going to run through the roll so that we can vote on your second. I think you did, John, right? Okay. So I just have names in no particular order. Sean, do you approve the minute?
Yeah.
Okay, and Lisa? Yes. Great, and Maggie? Yes. And Ron?
Yes.
And Alex?
Yes.
I do as well. Do we have anyone else on the call?
No.
No. Okay. So the meeting minutes are approved. And now we go on to the presentation from Apex regarding the emissions inventory. So we appreciate your coming to speak with us this evening. I know folks will have questions. So I think the format is about 10 minutes of presentation, and then we'll have about 35 minutes for questions and answers and getting clarification. And then if we run out of time, which we might, if committee members have additional questions, then they can send them to Apex. Through you, Jack, is that what you're doing the right way? Okay. So we'll make sure we get all the questions answered, but let's turn it over to you folks at Apex.
Yeah, so we're joined by Emma Anand and Slok Diwali. We've been working with them all summer through a community compact grant funded $50,000 research project. And as you've seen, they just have their sort of final or near final greenhouse gas inventory. Emma's been the sort of lead analyst on this summer, for sure.
Thank you so much, Josh. Yeah, we'll start with some quick introductions for Silk and I. So my name is Anna Anand. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based out in Portland, Oregon. And I have been the Apex consultant who's been primarily processing the data and inputting those into the Cirrus models, making sure that we're using the most up-to-date emission factors and calculating those inventories for both 2017 and 2022. And today I'm joined by my colleague Slok. So go for it, Slok. Give yourself an intro.
Thanks, Emma. Hello, everybody. My name is Slok Diwali. I'm also based out of the Portland, Oregon office. I'm the program manager on the team. And I work with Emma and her team to ensure that we are meeting our deliverables and they are technically sound.
Fantastic. Thank you, Slok. So committee, I was planning today to have a little bit of discussion time about how exactly what our methodology was for identifying the data, collecting it, and processing, and then inputting into the models. And then for the latter half of my 10 to 15 minutes, I will share my screen and just go through the 2022 Cirrus models. I know that you all have had a couple weeks to review, so I'm just going to do a pretty high level overview there, and then we can get into some questions. But to start off, this process, Josh and Mira at the time was around, we worked with them to identify the various applicable sectors to the town of Milton. And so the three sectors identified were stationary, transportation, and waste. This was all done through the lens of the greenhouse gas protocols, GPC. And so those were our three main sectors that we were focusing in on. So once we had identified those sectors, we went through the process of going through a extensive GPC checklist, basically to figure out which activities were actually occurring in the town of Milton. So natural gas, electricity, et cetera, et cetera. This again was done with our contacts at the town of Milton. So Josh, Mira, and Jack were a big part of that process. And from that definition, once we identified those exact activities, we were able to put together a request for information that gave us information on what exactly we needed, what time frame was necessary, what detail was necessary, as well as who would have that primary data. So for the most part, waste vendors, electricity vendors like Eversource, natural gas vendors, et cetera. Once that RFI was created, the Apex team and our points of contact at Milton kind of divided and conquered. So we're reaching out to various contacts at Eversource, National Grid, and other vendors to collect that information. And the information came in many different formats. So we had some email information, we had PDFs of actual invoices that stated consumptions and receipts, etc. So once we collected information, I went through on the Apex side and processed all that data, mostly getting it into Excel format and aggregating it by subcategory as well as activity type, so that it could be easily input into the Cirrus tool. So with that, most of the data within the inventories are from primary sources. So we were able to get most information from the 2022 timeframe, as well as from primary data sources. When we weren't able to do so, but we knew that activity was occurring within the town, we did our best to use MapC as well as MassSave to collect information that was historical. So most of that is actually 2021 data, the pieces of information that's historical, as well as some 2017 data, just because there are limitations with MapC and how often they're collecting information. An immaterial portion of the inventories are estimated. Those are mostly refrigerant information, and that's estimated using US EPA leak rates and some assumptions that, again, were vetted with Josh, Jack, and Mira throughout this process. For the 2022 inventory, 3.5% of the emissions are estimated for refrigerants. So once we collected all that primary information, I was able to then input all the activity data, apply conversion factors, and then finally I entered in the most up-to-date emission factors. So for 2017, we're making sure to use 2017 US eGrid factors and US EPA factors. As for 2022, we're using the most up-to-date 2022 emission factors there. So once that activity data was input, conversion factors were applied, then emission factors were entered and applied. We finally had our calculated emissions, which you all have had a bit of a chance to see, but I will go ahead and share my screen. Just give me 1 second here. Okay. Are you able to see my screen right now? Great, thank you very much. So Apex decided to go with the Cirrus model to help facilitate the calculations for Town of Milton's greenhouse gases. This model is built on the GHG protocol and was developed by C40 cities. So with that said, for example, all these purple tabs were pre-populated by the C40 cities. And so like the GWPs, the global warming potentials and conversion factors were already populated, and those are what we're able to use in the inventory. Otherwise, in orange and light blue, those are the areas that I, as the Apex consultant, was helping to populate and put information in. So city information has just some context for what the town of Milton is like. A lot of this information came from Josh, as well as various, credible sources on the internet. And then the data sources tab, this kind of gives some background and links to various websites that we were using. This has both the list of vendors where we were able to collect primary data, as well as MassSave and MapC, where we were able to get historic data. And then lastly, for emission factors, for the majority, we were using US EPA emission factors, the latest published. And then in some cases, I think really only one factor was from DEFRA 2022, and that's the water or wastewater treatment factor. And lastly, for our residual mix or our market-based electricity emission factor, we used Green E. And going into emission factors, the emission factor tab really gives a clear breakdown of which emission factors we're using, what each component is, the CO2, CH4, and N2O component, as well as which GWP we're using. And please note here that we are using AR4 mainly because the next step in this process, we're using a tool called the curb model, which is also a C40 cities model or tool. And that particular tool has limitations on what GWP is available. So we decided to go consistent. Since the curve model only has up to AR4, we're just going to use AR4 for the Cirrus models as well. So that's a note there. And I do want to thank the committee for giving really great feedback throughout this process. So I did add in this description column which table within the US EPA and then what tab for DEFRA emission factors came from. So thanks for that input, and your feedback was it came to light, I guess. That said, getting into the actual inventory, as I stated earlier, the 3 sectors that are applicable are stationary, transport, and waste. Since you all have had a chance to look through this, I'm just going to a detailed walkthrough through one of these tables, the residential buildings in the stationary tab, and then pretty much all the other tables follow this format. So it's applicable to the rest of the formats. But for residential buildings and stationary, we made sure we had the right subcategory. And then again, through those conversations with Josh, Jack, and Mira, we identified what activity was actually occurring in residential buildings throughout the town of Milton. And with that, we were able to collect that information. I made sure to add descriptions if the data was historic, like 2021 information. as the best possible data source. And then from there, we're able to actually input all that activity data. So again, this is just an annual aggregate, not a detailed month-to-month look or view. You can see in the refrigerants cell, you can link back to exactly what, I guess, intensity we were using for refrigerant losses and estimating those. Once the activity data is in, we want to make sure the units are correct, as well as account for any differences in the emission factor unit versus the activity data unit. And so the Cirrus tool pulls in that conversion from the conversion factor tool or tab. And from there, we pull in what emission factor is accurate for that particular piece of activity data. And again, the Cirrus tool is able to pull in the emission factors. So with all that information, then the Cirrus tool uses the activity data, conversion factor, and emission factor to give us our GHGs. And we can see the breakdown if we want to see that detail, but in column, let's see, AL, we actually have our total metric tons of CO2 equivalent. For more detail, if you scroll over to the right, we have the data quality. We have any descriptions to the methodology if, for example, there are estimates. So in this refrigerants line, I made sure to add in what the kind of background methods are. And lastly, we have our data source. Again, all the rest of the inventory tabs and tables follow the same format of activity data entry, emission factor entry, conversion factor entry. And you can see the transportation as well as the waste tabs are populated here. So scrolling over to the right tabs, we have multiple results tabs. I'm just going to touch on the ones that I personally find helpful for me. But obviously you will have access to the inventory, so feel free to discover what makes sense to you. And starting out, so the results Milton Municipal Only tab is something that I created. So again, thank you for your feedback, because you got a big mistake there where I had been linking to a cell that was incorrect. So thank you. That has been updated and changed, as you can see here. But this pulls in from the stationary transport and waste tabs any information that is municipal specific. So you can see if we scroll down here, it would pull in anything that in the description says municipal. I made sure to make that clear for my own benefit, but also for everyone else's. So again, this is linking there, and we have both the location and market-based calculations or emissions shown off to the right.
And just a time check, I think it'd be good to sort of wrap up your presentation portion so we have plenty of time for questions.
Sure. Yeah, can I go through one more tab? Is that okay?
Right.
Cool. So the last results tab I wanted to go through is the overview. And I particularly find the second table to be helpful since it does go into a more detailed breakdown. So you can see a more detailed view of subcategories and emissions, and then as well as scopes. Fantastic. I can stop sharing my screen and we can take questions.
This isn't the question, but I would just like to set some context, and I think this is consistent with what Alex had just noticed that he passed around. I think, anyway, and I'm curious to hear from committee members, but I think the most relevant use of this information is to help us prioritize and to help us think about where we need to focus our attention. So while it's very helpful to hear a little bit about the background and the sources, and I'm sure we'll have questions about that, I know I do just encourage us to think about sort of how we're going to use this information. And there's, some obvious big findings that come out of it. I would say things like the biggest sources of emissions are transportation and buildings, and to a much lesser degree, waste, and not in Alex's summary, but I do think it's important to know fugitive emissions as well. So that information is already sort of incorporated into the research agenda, but I did just want to point it out because I think it could be possible to get lost in the details, but I want us to think about how we're going to use this information.
I'll add that this is not the end of our contract with Apex. They'll also be doing a emissions reduction sort of pathways analysis to do that sort of tracking of the charge goals that you have as a committee and seeing what sort of specific reduction targets you can have with the existing data that we get out of this inventory. So hopefully one less thing to have to research.
Okay. Do members of the committee have questions for Apex?
I have a question. When you looked at transportation, Milton is has transportation corridors in it. And so people from outside Milton are traveling through Milton. And is that considered in the transportation figures?
Yes. So through the GPC, there are a couple of different ways to account for transportation. And Josh, Jack, and Mira made it clear that a priority was to take into account the kind of pass-through emissions that are occurring. So we worked with MassDOT to collect that information and break that out into passenger car versus more of a light-duty truck versus a semi-truck. So yes, that has been taken into account. Anything else I can clarify there?
Is there any way to know what part of it is, like you said, the pass-through versus travel within the town?
So sorry, I should have clarified. It's everything that's within the geographic boundary of the town of Milton is included here. So are you trying to?
Well, I'm saying if I'm trying to capture the carbon footprint of kids driving their kids back and forth to school versus someone who lives, 20 miles away just driving through Milton. We don't really have much control over, people driving through the town, but perhaps not that we have control over it, but it's maybe more in our purview if we're talking about trips that start and end within Milton.
Yeah, and that's something that we can talk to our contacts at MassDOT about. At this time, what we collected from MassDOT does not have that granularity, but we can note that down as something to connect with MassDOT on and see if that would be a possibility to see what mileage started and ended in the town of Milton. Yeah.
So I mentioned that's something that I looked into in the summary here. The definition of scope 1 is occurring in the town. So that's residents driving around town. The minute you leave town, it's not counted. Versus, it also includes anybody who's driving through town who's emitting CO2 while they're within the city. So I looked at a census data source for the vehicle miles traveled during the week that is linked to who live, but it would include the miles driven outside of Milton by people who live here. And I was kind of back at the envelope that I got a number between 25 to maybe 50% of the transportation emissions we're seeing within Milton being from residents. And they're not, it's not a subset, right? Anyway, it's discussed in here, and that should be available through the website for anyone who wants to take a look at it.
So also I know that MassDOT's doing, the study up on 28 for their roundabout. So they're collecting data now along different points on 28. So if you went up into Randolph, you'd see the strips that they're putting down. So I think if you reached out and went outside our town limits, you probably would have a good group of numbers, because they have it at a couple different points down Route 28, and then probably coming out of Boston on the Parkway, coming in. So we all kind of know the travel where everybody is in the morning coming through Milton and then at night coming back. So I think it would be fairly easy to collect the car information. And today was a nightmare of traffic. Everywhere.
Remember where we all want to drive us.
Nice. Yeah, that's.
And so I think, and also one of the things that I live off of 28, and I would love to see a road diet on 28. So I really would love to work with MassDOT. Right now it's a 4-lane highway. There's no bike lanes up there. So I think we can, as a town, and should pressure the state. I think it's unfair that they're solving their traffic problems through all of our little towns. And I think we should look to secure funds to put trees down the middle of Route 28, and then we can reduce cut-through traffic, as well as increase trees and then reduce CO2. So I don't know how much influence you have over MassDOT, but I think we're at a critical point right now that they really need a good talking to, and before they make decisions that are going to be more harmful to us.
Okay, yeah, thank you for sharing.
And
I have a question about your methodology, just switching from transportation for a second over to fugitive emission. And I was wondering if you could explain, I do see some information on the scope, the sources of fugitive emissions, but I'm wondering if you can clarify what percentage of fugitive emissions are from leaking gas pipes and what your source of data was on that.
Yeah, so there are a couple of data sources for fugitives in particular. So from MAPC, we were able to collect information on, let's see, 1 second, industrial, commercial, as well as lawn and garden fugitives, so CO2 and CH4. That data, unfortunately, was 2017 data, historic, but we know that it is occurring within the town limits, and so we wanted, for completeness, to include it, even though it might not be the most up-to-date and current. At least we are including it now. And so that is directly from MAPC data sources. As for refrigerant emissions, those are all estimated, all assumed to be R410A. And we did estimations for residential as well as commercial and institutional municipal buildings. So that's based off of square footage, and then the EPA loss rate of 10%, as well as some like cooling ton assumptions and charge assumptions. And the square footage there was directly from the Department of Public Works at Milton.
We're still not done yet at work.
So in terms of the gas pipe leaking, is that included in the NAPC commercial emissions, or where would that fit?
Yes, likely. Yeah, commercial, industrial.
Okay. Thank you.
Has that been particularly the like gas leaks? Has that been a top priority? Is that something that you're hearing a lot about? Has there been occurrences?
It happens all the time. If you walk around town, you will smell gas. There's a major initiative to replace gas pipes. And I worry that the data, I just don't know how good it is. It sounds like it's not very current. I know that there's an organization called HEAT that has been collecting data on gas pipe leaks particularly. So I'm interested in whether we might be able to incorporate that data into this emissions inventory. But more importantly, I mean, the inventory is important, but it's just a starting point. So I'm more focused on what do we do about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you said that group was called HEAT. Is that what you said?
With 2 E's.
Okay, with 2 E's. Thank you. Okay, interesting.
They have a GIS map of all the gas leaks all over the place and also all over the whole state, I should say, and also where gas infrastructure is being replaced.
Is there one section in town that's worse than others? Have you noticed?
It's everywhere I walk my dog, but that's not. It seems like, and I think I'm sensitized to it, but it's like everywhere I go and smell it.
So I have a question about forestry, which I see is deliberately left out of the survey, probably for good reasons. My understanding is that the Blue Hills, which covers a lot of territory in Milton, is managed by the state, but still, it seems to me that as part of the Climate Action Committee's duty or role, there ought to be a way to get a sense of the emissions that are both taken in and let out by the Blue Hills. And I don't know whether there's a protocol around you can use for doing that, but I'm interested.
Yeah, so you can hop in too, so if you'd like, but from my understanding, kind of collecting like avoided emissions or emission sinks, like carbon sinks like that, the GHG protocol does have its own separate calculation or methodology to do this through. And I believe that the US EPA also has information on that. For this project, when we were, discussing with or looking at it through the lens of the GPC, and also discussing what kind of sectors are occurring within the town of Milton, we identified that was, not occurring, but so if you want to hop in any more on that, feel free to.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. And I know our conversation today has been mostly focused on the inventory and the data side of it. The regional context of where Milton sits and how it affects its climate will be considered as part of the climate action plan. But because the inventory is calculated based on certain methodology and protocols that are in place, we did not capture the carbon sequestration part of it, but that is a different study. We can do both how it impacts in town. There are tools available. So what kind of tree cover do you have in Milton and how that impacts, in city carbon sinks, and also the regional context. We will take that into consideration in task 2 of this project. It wasn't part of the inventory numbers right now.
Well, I hope you can find a way to include it.
Yeah, I would agree that, just to give a specific example where that would have been used recently, we had a sort of significant town discussion around the siting of a new school, looking at land that's currently forested, and there was a lot of uncertainty about the climate impact of clearing that land, right? So I think when there are development decisions, we have a lot of.
Oh my God, there's a cat.
Sorry. We have a lot of different kinds of forested land within the boundaries of Milton, and when there's specific decisions to be made about whether to develop it or to restore it, I think that's very useful information.
And I somehow can't believe, but maybe it's possible, that the DCR is a group and Natchez doesn't have some sort of data available on this topic.
It may be something that we can think about in our report, even if it's not in the inventory. John?
What proportion of the inventory data is actually based on EPA monitoring in this area? And specifically, if there is data based on monitoring, where are the monitoring stations that are being used?
Yeah, so what portion that we're using from EPA is actually more the emission factors themselves. So each year they publish a new emission factors hub. As for data that's coming directly from the EPA, we do not have any. So we were reaching out to Eversource, National Grid, Sunrise Scavenger, et cetera, directly to get what consumption Milton is having for, waste, water, and stationary and transport. So at this time, really just the emission factors are coming from the US EPA, and our data sources are the direct vendors that are being used. Does that answer your question there?
Yeah. I didn't see that there was really any use of real data other than the emission factors. And I just wondered if there was there. And apparently there's.
When you say EPA monitoring stations, what, I'm not familiar with what they might be monitoring or measuring.
Monitoring F2, monitoring ozone, monitoring
And concentrations in the air.
Yeah.
But you're
All of that is continuously monitored. But there are monitoring stations in the area, and I was just wondering where they were in relationship to Milton. There are.
It's useful from an air quality perspective, but if the wind's blowing,
yeah, that's why you gotta have actual measurements.
Why not show up in-
What the impact is particular.
Building on the question I asked earlier, is it possible to get data on the number of cars coming to and from schools for Milton and buses?
Schools in particular and buses in particular. I mean, we can, school buses, okay, school buses.
Or at the high school cars, the students. drive-
Well, I mean, both cars.
Yeah.
And school buses. So basically, the amount of traffic associated with transporting children to and from school.
Okay. That's something that we can look into and talk with both our MassDOT contacts as well as Josh and Jack, since I believe there's a particular school bus vendor.
Some data from First Student, who we contract our buses from. We don't actually, town of Milton does not manage any of the school buses. It's all First Student. So actually, when you look at our sort of municipal emissions from our school fleet, it's actually just the two training cars that they use for driver's ed. All the rest is the sort of contracted stuff that is captured in the broader MassDOT data, but not regularly from the school district. I spoke with Dr. Pavlicek early on in the process, and he didn't immediately say, oh, I have this info for you. Maybe the new
Right.
superintendent has something, but outside of knowing how many students come in day to day, they might have done some survey, but I don't know if it's recent.
Right.
I think it's kind of only accessible via a survey, rather than any sort of existing data sets.
Well, I know they have those those cables they put across the road, and so I'm wondering if they've ever put them across the entrances to the schools to do a study.
It's unlikely. I know Glover School got funding a few years ago from the Safe Routes to School program, and that may have included some data collection specific to Glover.
Yeah.
But that's not really something I know we would have on hand. I doubt it. We can check.
I would think they would know how many buses are going to each school.
Exactly.
Basic questions.
Count them.
Yeah, but I would think it's more like at the high school level, the kids driving.
Mhm.
And then I found that Pierce, I felt like everybody dropped their kids off at Pierce.
Yeah. Well, I live near there, so
Yeah.
I
Yes, yeah.
I know the crossing guard very
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
But there's also private schools in town.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Curry College and.
And one of the reasons my kids were always busing, so they got the bus, and then when it was no longer covered and I had to pay for it, then I started driving them.
Right.
So one option would be, if we're trying
Exactly.
to reduce, emissions, is
Yes.
you then pay for more kids to take the bus.
Right,
But then I know transportation is one of the most expensive things in the school budget,
right.
so I don't know. if
And
it'd
it's
be-
our biggest
Yeah.
vendor, so.
Yeah.
Something.
The school buses are helping, not hurting that though.
No, I'm not talking about the
Yes,
school
but-
buses.
yes.
I'm saying, I'm interested to know, based on this data, like how many families could take a bus, but maybe don't, versus walking and riding their bikes. And, some kids don't live near their schools. It's complex, it's a very complex issue.
Certainly not the only factor.
Yeah.
There may be survey data out there,
Schools,
but it's not going to be easily accessible from this broader data pool that we've been
Yeah.
pulling from several.
And for our part, as part of the climate action plan, we will look at possibilities of a mobility study, just to see sustainable mobility study, just to at least at a high level get some indication as to where that is possible, what the data availability is, and how we can plan around that. So that's in the works. It's not just we are still fine tuning that.
And just for context, when Slope says the climate action plan, that they're developing some sort of frameworks for our climate action planning work. They're not going to craft a sort of parallel climate action plan
Right.
for you.
Right, absolutely.
Can you describe what that framework is?
Sure, and Slope and Emma, please, but it's providing some high priority goals and targets for your sort of reduction pathways year over year. Some of the best practice sort of policies that we should consider from the sort of technical side of things and emissions reductions, as well as they'll be providing us with design support for creating graphics, sort of charts, as well as a logo for the climate action plan that I know we talked about with you all 2 months ago, I believe, and I think that would be really integral to have this committee's input on.
Right.
Will that training, will it be able to say, if you take this action or, enact this policy, you could expect an X% reduction in the emissions? Like, does it go to that level of detail, or do we expect?
The reductions pathway should have that kind of nuance because we have the sort of distinct real data from the GHG inventory.
And as just I just want to clarify that as you can see, the methodology of this can be a bit complicated and a little technical and filled with jargon. So one of the things that we are doing along with the marketing team is putting a methodology summary together that is easier to understand so that it can be communicated out more widely.
Great, thank you. I think getting some sort of sense of what the framework will look like will probably be helpful to us, because we are already, today we'll be discussing sort of our research plan and outline for the climate action, for our climate action plan. So knowing how that might integrate with what Apex is going to produce, I think would be helpful to our thinking.
You've received the scope of work, I believe, in some past conversations, but that has in detail what we contracted with Apex for, but I can send that out again.
Yeah, that would be good. Thank you.
Ask one more question. In terms of the residential gas consumption data, which, it seems pretty clear and easy to get. Do you have with that the number of appliances in each residence? Obviously, you can get the amount of gas a particular residence uses, but would it be worthwhile for us to know whether this includes a furnace, a fire heater, a stove, an outside fire pit, et cetera? And is that kind of data available? Because when you think about it, this total volume of gas that comes into town and is used certainly gets used in all these different appliances. And as we think about how we could reduce that, and you think about, well, maybe you could have people set their thermostats a degree or two lower, but at the same time, you have people with a fire pit outside that runs overnight with nobody at it and so forth. So that perhaps at least knowing those number of appliances would be of some value.
So in the current data set that we were able to collect from Mass Save, really all we get is the aggregate of natural gas usage. So there is not that granularity of like number of households, number of appliances, or average number of appliances in each household, et cetera.
But we do have fuel type data from Mass Energy Insight, so we know if you're using oil versus natural gas, but we don't know if you have set.
I believe if someone has a gas stove installed, they have to pull a permit to get it installed. So the building permits might provide a window. That might be some data.
That's also typically would be tied to the fuel type that a house uses, by and large. Some people will have a sort of oil power heater and use a gas stove. But in my conversations with inspection services, it seems like the capacity for like deep data analysis from the Permitize software is limited. So we can do what we can, but can't make any promises.
Yeah. I was just thinking you could have gas heat, but not a gas stove, but if you pull a permit for a gas stove. Might be window.
Yeah. Unless the gas company has that kind of data, it would be pretty hard to get, but at the same time, has potential to be important if you're going to try and do something in relationship to natural gas consumption. How you can deal with that?
I know that Mass Save data has information on appliances, energy efficient appliances that have been adopted. So that's not all appliances, that's actually when they, when people have upgraded to an efficient appliance. Yeah. Arthur, did you have a comment? I thought maybe I Saw you were gonna speak.
Hi, thanks. My apologies for not being present. I'm okay, but I was recently exposed to COVID and I wanted to be respectful of everybody this evening. It appears to be accelerating and I want to be careful for you as good colleagues. My question is with respect to the gas consumption. It seems strange that we can't obtain the units in the community. By that I mean household units that have any gas consumption whatsoever. Is that not something that's available through any entity, including the state?
This is households with no natural gas consumption? Is that the question?
No, with gas consumption.
Hmm. We know the number of households that use which fuel type. That's through Mass Energy Insight. So yes, we have that data.
But that's what I was hoping. That's what I had thought. It sounded like I was hearing the opposite, and I just wanted to clarify that. So thank you.
At the property level or just in aggregate?
Yeah, no, it's not a map, but this house seasons oil. This
Depending, we know.
Technically, actually, we know the gas lines and the people mapper does have fuel type tied to the parcel.
But some parcels have both.
But I know I've seen that data point in the sort of.
I think by and large, if you have a gas line, you heat with gas, and if you don't, you heat with oil.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heated with oil and had a gas stove. That's what I inherited.
We're just about at the end of the time that we have for discussion. Are there any other burning questions for Apex before we let them go for the evening? Okay, thank you so much. This has been very informative. We really appreciate your hard work.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah,
Thanks, Em.
thank you.
Thank you.
Please feel free to email any questions to Josh and Jack, and they can get those over to Sloak and the other Apex colleagues and myself. So thank you for your time today. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So the next thing on our agenda, is to discuss initial feedback on the research outline. And so there's two things that are included in the research outline. One is an outline of the climate action plan itself, which is kind of high level, and I'm not actually envisioning we'll talk about this a lot tonight, but just want to point it out. That looks like this, kind of a outline type document, and it has introduction and information about context and the emissions inventory, et cetera, and then a section for key action areas and the kinds of information that we might include for that, for each action area. If you have any feedback on this, I'm happy to talk about it, but the main thing that I want to make sure we talk about is this other document, which is an Excel spreadsheet, and it's in very tiny type here, but it is showing down the left-hand side the different topics that we might want to address in our climate action plan, and those are drawn from the emissions inventory when we're talking about greenhouse gas mitigation. So transportation, buildings, fugitive emissions, solid waste, those are the four top areas of emissions, plus conservation, because we've talked about conservation as being very important. And then we have a second section for climate change adaptation and risk mitigation. We've talked about that being important too, and we want to include that in our plan. So I pulled in that from our municipal vulnerability preparedness program, top climate change hazards, which are intense storms, flooding, wildfire, heat waves, and drought. So that's just sort of an orientation of what the different topics are. And then across the spreadsheet are different kinds of information you might want to gather on this. if you are able to bring up the spreadsheet, that would be wonderful, so you can see it. I should say, I am not expecting that we will use this spreadsheet actually as a way to gather our information because it will become quickly overwhelming, but it was a quick way to put it in one place. So the kinds of information that are in there currently, and this is just draft, is initial research questions, related bylaws, there we go, related bylaws, regulations and policies, related projects or initiatives that might be going on, not necessarily in Milton, it could be anywhere. Examples of successful efforts from other communities, equity considerations, things to think about with regard to equity, information, resources and data, funding resources, lead actors and key stakeholders who are the key people or institutions. And then all the way to the right, we'll talk about this later, is climate action planning, legally. So our names there, so we'll get to that. But the main thing I want to make sure we have a chance to talk about is, are these the right topics? And are these the right kinds of information that we want to be gathering as we research these topics? Because ultimately, I think anyway, we want to be making sure we're gathering the same kinds of information so that when we come to our next point, pull this together, we are drawing, we have similar sources. Did you have a comment?
What happened to the plan?
Well, then we need to implement it, and that will be, not us,
Yeah.
the town.
Okay.
And
Well, also, your charge does include monitoring. Implementation.
yes, monitoring, right. And so that's why in the outline, I have a section for each action area about recommendations for implementation. So as we're writing the plan, I think we ought to be thinking about not just what's the problem, but what our recommendations are for addressing the problem and who can do that and what the funding strategy is and all of that.
Does someone need to approve the plan?
Yes,
Who?
the select board will need to approve it. They asked us to write it, we'll bring it to them. And, but along the way, we'll need to get a lot of feedback from other people.
One thing I would suggest adding is the task of educating people about what we're doing, about what the climate needs in Milton are, and what people can do to make a difference.
Yes. And I had imagined that education as sort of woven into each topic area, but, we might think about having a separate section on education as a whole. So I'll make a note of that. It's a good idea.
I was thinking about transportation and buildings, perhaps dividing them into like government, municipal versus private. Because it seems like our recommendations will be very different. I don't know if it's worth breaking them out in different rows or.
Hang in there, kiddo.
I was curious if there was a list. That was one of the questions I had tonight. Like, is there a list of all the buildings? Because it looks like the town has done a lot of grants and funding through the green communities. And I want to kind of tick and tie what building got what funding from any programs or grants that we've done to do like upgrades. Is that information available, or who do I go to kind of hunt down that information?
Consolidated Facilities, Chris Hayden is their director. They manage our green communities grants, which have largely been for LED upgrades in middle schools. So Chris would be that source, or you could talk to me or Jack and we could show it to him.
Okay, yeah. So when you go in the mass communities, it looks like maybe $1 million we've done funding over the last probably like 5 or 6 years. The school.
Mary, I just want to just kind of put what you're saying in the context of the research plan, because I do want to kind of stay focused on this for now. So I think you're talking about grants to date, and maybe this fits with funding resources. So as we think about each action area, we can think about funding, both funding that we have received to date and funding that we might pursue. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I didn't mean to focus so much on the funding, but definitely wanted to get a list of the buildings and if they've done projects to see like that we've made some impact. for the baseline?
Okay. Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think for each of these topics, we're gonna have many, many questions about sources of data. I don't want to talk about that now because we will get lost and we won't finish, but it's a great thing to start thinking about. And so, so keep note of those questions. I want to make sure we have time to come back to that, not in today's meeting, but in future meetings.
And just at a process level, we have kind of an integration challenge where like each of us is kind of separately be learning a lot of things. Organizing them in a way that makes sense to us as individuals, but then how do you bring that information together so the committee can synthesize it?
So are there any topics now, kind of down the left-hand side, transportation, buildings, fugitive emissions, solid waste, conservation, and all the climate change adaptation and risk mitigation areas? Are there any topics that we are missing?
Just to kind of build off of what Lisa said, I mean, I think it could go down to the activity level, like within the inventory, they've broken out all of these top level activity categories like buildings and transport into a lot of subcategories. And so we'll probably need to focus action items at that level. But probably what we want to capture here is anything that's not in that inventory, that's not on this list, that we actually need to be focusing on. And so I think one thing like that we caught is conservation, carbon sequestration.
Yeah, so I was kind of wondering if, I know different boards ask for input from different committees. So you brought up the whole land swap thing, and that piece of property has the most biodiverse trees and ecology and really more than even found in the Blue Hills. So I'm kind of wondering if moving forward, if this committee would ever weigh in on projects around town, just like other committees weigh in. So just thinking like from the planning board, because I'm here representing the planning board, we have a project in front of us up on Highland Street, which is,
I'm so sorry.
oh yeah, no, so.
But that's a big question.
Yeah.
And not what we need.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so eventually are we going to have that type of input or not?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it. Let's put it on an agenda for a future meeting. It's a really important question. I think it really gets to the heart of what our role is. And, you know, we have this plan to write, but there's also decisions happening all the time. And should we be weighing in on them? Should we weigh in on them now? I think it's a little too early, like right this minute, but you know, at some point, maybe, and I think we should talk about that. And I'll definitely make a note that I'm sorry, I'm just going to be really focused on this only because we have to get to the end of this so that we can have public comments and get out on time. So I will make a note about that and we'll come back to it for sure.
I will add that I think this research outline reflects well the inventory. I don't see things from the inventory that are missing from the outline, so I think the topics work.
The roads are going to about their house.
Does anybody, before we go to comments, does anybody else see a topic that we are missing? Okay, not to say we couldn't add it later, but it'll just be easier because we're going to kind of assign names. So I want to make sure we have somebody for every time. Okay, so now let's think about the columns. And again, we can add stuff later, but as we sort of set out on our path for trying to research and gather information, we want to be sure we're kind of looking for the same sorts of things. So is there something that we're missing in terms of figuring out what our research questions are, related bylaws, related projects, examples of successful efforts, equity, information, funding resources, key stakeholders, anything really critical that's not there that we really need to gather information on? Okay. Well,
You're thinking of something and then it's there, like data sources, that was there.
this is stuff we talked about at our last meeting, so it's really just pulling together what we all talked about. So that's good. Okay, so then what I want to do now is just talk a little bit about next steps and see if this makes sense to you. What I'm proposing is that for our next meeting, we, and I say Alex and I, because we both volunteered to do this, write a template, which is an example of how we can take this information and fill it out for one topic and share that around with the group. And anyone else who wants to do this would be totally welcome to do it. But I think it'll be easier for us to work as a committee and kind of gather information in a similar, not that our approach needs to be similar, but that the product looks kind of similar if you haven't seen. So does that sound like that would be helpful to have a sort of a template or an example next time of a couple of topics? And then the idea would be everyone else on the committee would go out and do the same thing for their topic. That's not going to be like the final chapter of the plan or anything. That's just like, okay, here's our little summary, our synopsis of this topic, what we know, what we want to know, what, where we're looking, stuff like that. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Does anyone else want to write a template besides Allison?
I have a question. As someone representing the school board, right, the buildings and transportation are like the two really big pieces of it. And so I feel divided about, I know I signed up for transportation. A lot of the research I've done so far talked a lot about buildings and I'll just need some guidance on how to represent my committee and, do this research, or I guess I could report it.
Liberated from the spreadsheet format, say,
Yeah.
Lisa's focusing on the buildings and transportation, many activities that occur within the context of the school system.
Or another way to think about it might be, I do think it's going to be important for us to have at least one, maybe two people for each topic to say, hey, I'm really going to focus on whatever it is. But that's not to say you can't also weigh in on other things. Sure. And when we come back with our little write-ups, that is not the end of the story. That's not like, okay, you wrote the book, we're done, we're not talking about it. It's the beginning of the story. And then we're going to talk about it a lot with each other and with everybody else, like the other boards in town and other committees and residents and, experts. And that's just the beginning of the conversation. So I don't want us to feel like if we sign up for a topic here, that's all we can think about. It's just, let's start there and focus on that so we can make a little progress and then regroup and then, keep sharing ideas. Does that make sense? Okay. So now we're at the point where we've covered the research outline, which is great. And I want to make sure we do have at least one person for every topic and then nobody hates the topic that they're signed up for. So I did take names down at the last meeting, and if you change your mind, just let me know. But we do have some topics that are unfilled. So right now, Lisa, I do have you for transportation. Is that still okay? Does anyone want to join this one? Be a little big topic. It's going to be a really important topic.
Yeah, I do think it probably makes sense to have someone focused on like the school annual. And essentially do it as this, the school, representative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it might be hard to do that and all of transportation.
Well, I'll give it a start. I'm sure, as everyone who's talked about the traffic today, we all have thoughts.
Yeah, and definitely, I think we're all going to need to weigh in on all of these. So, okay, but that'd be great if you could start. And then we have buildings, and Mary and Alex, I know you both raised your hands last time to see about the buildings that both done. Right. And fugitive emissions, I put my name down for that. Happy to have anyone join me, or I can switch. People excited about fugitive emissions. You can tell I'm on a mission about fugitive emissions. Okay, solid waste. Arthur, I put you down for that because I think you said you were good with anything. I needed a name. Is that okay with you?
The acoustics are pretty bad, but I said that I would take whatever it is that you would like me to do.
Yeah. So solid waste is okay?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. And then conservation, Maggie and Ron, you both expressed interest in that. That's still okay? All right. And then, so that's great. That covers all of the types of emissions or emission areas. But then we have also the climate change risk. So just to remind you, those are intense storms, flooding, wildfire, heat waves, and drought. And this is again thinking about how do we plan for and adapt to these kinds of risks. Does anyone have a topic that they're excited about for this? Okay, Alex is for flooding, wildfires.
I'd be interested in flooding.
Arthur, that was you for flooding?
Correct.
There's some,
Unless somebody else prefers it.
Yeah, no, that's good. And then I heard wildfire. Lisa and Ron. And John, okay.
and that does relate to heat waves and drought.
Yeah.
I mean, I think,
Do you want to group them together? Is that easier somehow?
I mean, wildfire is a result of drought and heat.
Yeah. I said I would cover intense storms, so unless anyone wants to fight me for it, I can do that. Anybody else feeling strongly about heat waves or drought? Okay.
I'm happy to take one, Tracy, if it's not assigned.
Okay. I'm gonna suggest, that was Mary saying she would take one.
Yep.
John, how about if you take heat waves and Mary take drought, just to kind of spread things around, and Lisa, if you take wildfires?
Okay.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Did you catch all that? Okay, I'm gonna read through it again. So Tracy will do storms, Alex and Arthur will do flooding, Lisa will do wildfire, John will do heat waves, and Mary will do drought. Is that okay? I get it right? Okay. Excellent. So we will circulate a template for next time, 2 templates. You know what, maybe Alex, you should do, like, we should split it up and have one on emissions and one on adaptation. So we have one of each kind of template. We can talk about that. Okay.
So were you envisioning that this template would be, the building very large, or would be more, action item within the area of buildings?
I was imagining it was gonna be buildings writ large, and it might have placeholders. I mean, that's a huge topic, right? We're not gonna, in the course of a month, fill everything out. But it would be a way of organizing the information, and maybe the way we organize the information is to split it up into different parts, and we only fill out one part for next month. But I think it's just, my hope is that by having a template, we can think about how to organize our thoughts and our process, so that then when we send everybody out to do it,
Yeah, this is what we'll figure out.
we'll figure it out. We'll come back to you, and then you guys can give us feedback and see how, and we can change it. Does that sound okay? Okay. Moving on in the agenda, we are just about on time, actually. So I want to move now to discussing and potentially voting on any proposals from community members for town funding to support the climate action planning committee's work. And I know Alex had put a few ideas out, and I don't know if you want to talk about them. And then if anybody else has ideas, we'll talk about those.
Yeah, I want to just put a few quick thoughts down in the email, because I think we do, because we're probably not in a position to make big asks at this point. Doesn't mean we shouldn't think of small things that might really help us to be more successful as we get started. By no means exhaustive, but is there any formal request you need to make for, say, staff support? I know that there's a lot of really useful GIS data in town. We have a GIS expert who assesses across the hall. I know he's got other duties, right?
You already paid for Alan's, so Alan Bishop is our.
So nothing formal.
No, but Jack is your staff person. He deals with a lot of stuff, obviously, but I request if you're looking for town municipal data or support, try and ask Jack rather than going sort of directly to the source, just to.
Makes sense. And then, I put $1,000 down, but it's more like a small amount of money for digital advertising or print advertising experiments. Because I think one thing we're gonna have to learn is how to reach people. And I've done just enough of this at Sustainable Milton to know that it's hard. So, and there's some things that, where a little bit of money might help us learn a lot about what works and what doesn't. Or perhaps we could fund an internship for somebody who's studying, a high school student or somebody studying social marketing and public relations at Great College to drive some of that learning for us. And then the last thing was maybe small amounts of money for expenses. I don't know what it costs to do a library.
It's free in the library for town boards, committees.
Like you want to have donuts and makes people show up.
I hear that. I got food funding for our microgrid project, and it's been a whole process, getting W-9s and peeling numbers and invoices, but
Maybe sustainable.
yeah, it was likely the easiest to not get it directly from.
That's what I could come up with and what I put up for this.
Great, thank you. Any comments on those or other ideas that people have?
Do we have any thoughts on, well, I guess this is asking the town for this one, right? This isn't like Greg.
Yeah, it's certainly not the only strategy available to us, but the one that we're supposed to say.
And I should say too, the reason this came up initially was we were thinking if we wanted to put in a request for money from the town that was a formal request, we had to do it now.
Right.
Because if it's over $10,000, it needs to go through a certain process and we have to get that. These requests that Alex is talking about are small and don't have to be done right now. So you don't have to make a decision on this now.
Is that true?
So, I mean, 30B procurement laws are relevant certainly to some of this work, but procurement is not the same as sort of a operating budget for a board and committee. All of the sort of committee budgets are determined at town meeting. So the best way to do this, especially for the longevity of this, is getting that as a budget through town meeting. Just like how the master plan implementation committee has money for their studies and efforts. Even sort of non-procurement style requests. I have relatively limited experience, sure, and from that experience, I don't think it's simple or easy or particularly able to be done without a sort of invoice in hand or specific sort of budget that it's not just we'd like about $1,000 for the broad printing and marketing stuff. For this, we don't have money in our sort of accounting for you all. We could there's maybe a world where MPIC's budget could go towards, some amount towards this work for your sort of broader planning studies, but even so, without a specific invoice or quote.
I remember hearing that, I think Maggie, you mentioned I forgot the number, but you mentioned the budget that NPSC has, and that's being the largest budget any committee has. I think it's what you said.
I think it is, yeah.
What's a more typical budget? Is the mode like zero?
Zero, yeah. Yeah, MPIC is the committee that does most of the sort of studies and sort of consultant hiring.
Yeah, basically here said we need to engage the town, and that's not.
Yeah, I think
Not easy. So what committees that have to do outreach? I mean, how does that work?
the Community Preservation Committee has 5% of the CPA funds that they take go to the Ordinance Administration. That pays their clerk, that does their admin fees. That's baked into the wall of Community Preservation Act. The Affordable Housing Trust also does some work with advertising, units that are on affordable housing lotteries. And they don't use trust funds for that, that has to go specifically, but they have, I believe, an operating budget that goes towards some amount of that.
But that was approved at town meeting.
So taking over on, they have an operating budget as well, actually. But they have a trust fund that they use for affordable housing work. I genuinely, I would say, go to a nonprofit, go to the Copeland Foundation. It'll come with far fewer strings and far more capacity to do it in the short term.
I think that may fit well with our timing because I think we're not probably quite ready yet. We're at a very early stage and these ideas are great ideas and I hope others will have other ideas, but we haven't really had a chance to get traction yet, is my sense. And so I would suggest that we continue to think about this and continue to bring ideas forward with the idea that maybe the most flexible way to do this is going to be to go to a private foundation or some other funding source where we can do it when we're ready and get that information gathered. Does that make sense to everybody?
If you get to a point where you're doing an MVP grant, obviously engagement and community engagement is a big part of that application process and should be a part of that. So it'll be baked into a grant and be better from an MVP application, but until you get a town meeting.
That should be municipal vulnerability.
Yes, municipal vulnerability and preparedness.
So is there another round of that anticipated?
There are rounds annually, I think. Applications are rolling. This upcoming grant, I think, closes end of October, so I don't think we don't have a plan in place for that.
Are there any last comments on funding? We do need to move to public comment, but are there any last thoughts about funds? Yeah.
I'm good about funding. What about the template? So I think it's important for the committee to establish goals, emission reduction goals for each of the sectors, and maybe include some baseline information. So I'm wondering if the template will include that, or does that come under this?
Great question.
Yeah, goals on the columns there.
Yeah.
So that's a good idea.
Yes. Yeah, we certainly could. And I think, well, based on what you were saying earlier about what I think X can provide and will provide, that would be very informative because like at the start of this, we may have no idea like how much is it reasonable to think we could reduce emissions, but that could help us. So
I mean, for what it's worth, the IPCC, the governmental panel for climate change scientists, strongly recommend 50% emission reductions across the board by 2030.
yes, and then we get into discussions of what is actually possible.
Yeah, right. No, I know that.
Yeah, it's referenced in the law and it's also at charge at the schools.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's great. I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah, we'll add that to the template and then we can for each topic talk about it. Any last comments before we turn to public comments? And sorry for being a taskmaster on the agenda. I knew it was going to be tight today and it is, but we will bring up other topics that we didn't have a chance to talk about today in future meetings. So do we have any public comments?
Yeah, good evening. My name is Dale Smith. I live at 60 Cannon Avenue. And, you were looking for possible additional topics to put into your spreadsheet, your matrix. The two that come to mind. One is regulatory process and approval. There are, as you probably know, there are 10 cities and towns in Massachusetts which have already adopted the specialized stretch code. And there are at least 10 more communities that are waiting in the wings. So there's an opportunity there for this committee to promote that. And then sort of getting on what Josh mentioned, I think advocacy is going to be key too. One thing to come up with a plan, and a plan certainly helps you know where you're going, what you want to achieve. But I would hope this committee would have a preference for action, because as one of your members pointed out, time is short. And every year that goes by without concrete action to actually reduce our equipment is a lost option.
My name is Tucker Sneddon. I'm also a district funding idea. There is an organization that is going to be celebrating its centenary in 2024. They have the capacity, the decision making, but it is looking for opportunities. Is there a process, is a certain process, and to or whatever? I will maybe try to use networking. Hi, so Peggy calling me to do here now. This is trying to have that, so I'll read it really fast. This is wonderful, this committee. I'm so impressed with all the work you're doing and how professional and high quality it is. Thank you for doing that. My name is Deborah Milbauer, and I'm a town meeting member of Precinct 4 and a professor of public health at Northeastern University. I'm the parent of a Milton High School graduate and a Milton High School 11th grade soccer player. I'm also a neighbor to a proposed plastic turf field at Milton High School. I am here representing Grass for Guile, a group of concerned Milton residents worried about the short, medium, and long-term impacts of a pending plastic turf project at Milton High School, managed by the town Department of Parks and Recreation. The plan is to install an ocean of non-recyclable plastic abutting wetlands, conservation land, and the country garden. There is not one single plastic turf recycling facility in the country. Plastic turf is replaced every 8 to 10 years, which means thousands of non-recyclable plastic turf fields ends up in landfills, incinerated, dumped, or stockpiled. The issue is currently before the Milton Conservation Commission, who will soon decide to issue permits or not. I am here to ask this Climate Change Planning Committee, as part of your final action plan, to consider recommending a town-wide plastic turf ban, or at least a moratorium, so that the rest of the town can catch up with the fast-paced changing science and regulations regarding plastic turf fields. And not just for this single project that's pending, but for future turf fields already being discussed by some parents. The request has been put before the Milton Board of Health, who first agreed and then declined to host a hearing to consider the matter. Several cities and towns throughout the state and country have already done so, as reported by the New York Times. I've linked to all of this and lots of other outlets. Regulations around plastic are rapidly changing. Just this morning, I heard that Governor Maura Healey said she will sign an executive order prohibiting state agencies from buying single-use plastic bottles. And several bills are pending in the Massachusetts State House to ban the government purchase of plastic turf. Milton should not install a plastic product that soon may be banned statewide. Aside from the harm to young athletes who experience higher rates of concussion, ACL tears, heat exhaustion, and infections from mundane skin scrapes, and aside from the toxic runoff shed PFAS and other toxic chemicals into our waterways and soil, I am here to speak to your planning group specifically regarding plastic. Plastic is destroying our oceans, contaminating our bodies, and contributing to climate change. Plastic is manufactured with crude oil and gas, primary contributors to carbon emissions, which are driving forest fires, deadly heat waves, flooding, and massive once-in-a-century storms happening multiple times in 1 century. What's more, an ocean of non-recyclable plastic in Milton High School will create heat islands, and importantly for this group, will emit CO2 instead of what natural grass does, which absorbs CO2. And I might add that this committee might consider adding Milton's already existing 2 turf fields to your emissions inventory that you just beautifully discussed. I've found research that shows about 2 acres of turf is about equal to 55.6 tons of CO2 being emitted. In recognition of the environmental and public health disaster that plastic is causing, Milton passed a single-use plastic bag ban, a single-use plastic bag ban. And many of us schlep water bottles around to avoid purchasing single-use plastic water bottles. Yet, here we are planning to install the equivalent of 1.8 million plastic bottles, a statistic that Adidas boasted after their recent construction of a plastic football field in Miami using recycled plastic bottles. 1.8 million for one field. It's 3 more sentences. I realize that Milton sports programs are experiencing an acute shortage of fields for which I'm quite sympathetic, but the reasonable and real need for fields should not be trumped by the larger looming crisis that plastic causes. One plastic field will not solve our field shortage, just as one grass field will not solve climate change. Yet, like many towns across the Commonwealth who are successfully managing organic grass fields at lower cost without lost playing time, Milton must choose brave leadership. We must have the courage to start somewhere, and that somewhere starts with this committee. Thank you for recommending a turf ban or moratorium as part of your final recommendation and action. Thank you so much. Tonight, I have copies of this.
I think we have a hand raised in the Zoom.
Zoom? Thanks. Please go ahead. Kate.
Kate, go ahead.
Me, I can go?
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I sat through the whole meeting and I actually had some remarks prepared and I changed them because I was listening so carefully to how you were thinking about how you were going to move forward with your strategy as a committee. First of all, I think this committee is exceptionally important in town. And I want to describe why. I think it could help kind of fill in some of the gaps that are created in things. And let me describe exactly what I mean. Some of your discussion tonight has been about weighing in on town projects. And that's kind of why I'm here, because your committee can fill a missing role. My name is Kate Burak, and we all know about what happened on September 12th. 11 inches of rain fell in Leominster in a 4 to 5 hour window. And that might seem exceptional, but over the last couple of decades, our region has seen a 50% increase in extreme precipitation events. And a climate scientist at UMass says that the type of storm we might expect to see every 500 years. Now, by the end of the century, this rainfall pattern could be the 100-year storm. In other words, the probability of a storm like this in any given year will increase by a factor of 5. So my point is, the flood risk keeps getting worse. And why am I saying that? You already know that. I live along Pine Tree Brook in an EPA-rated AE flood zone, a 100-year flood zone. That means my home is at high risk for flooding. You can look my house up on Redfin, and there's a climate warning on it, actually. A lot of the Pine Tree Brook neighborhood is in a GIS-mapped flood zone. I mention this because 3 major development projects are currently in construction or proposed within a half-mile stretch of Pine Tree Brook in an area that is also mapped as an environmental justice neighborhood. The 3 projects, the Ice House project, the proposed new school building and grounds, and the Guile artificial field, these 3, once developed, will make up approximately 10 acres of impervious surface, disrupting grass and trees that hold water. According to Penn State Extension, stormwater runoff from 1 acre of impervious surface equals runoff from 20 acres of grassland. The water has to go somewhere. All of the water will end up in Pine Tree Brook. Pine Tree Brook doesn't just affect the Pine Tree Brook neighborhood. It flows all the way through Milton to Lower Mills. Here's the problem. Each of these projects is seen as discrete. To different committees in town see it as something else they have to pass. We need someone to see the overall aggregate. What do these 3 projects, how did the 3 of them work together? A half a mile strip of Pine Tree Brook. This is something that your committee can do. It seems like it's in your purview, and a good question for us to ask is, how can we approach development proactively? Climate change will affect this neighborhood, and we need your help now. And I urge you to consider the flood risk mitigation needs to be tied to development planning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there any final public comments? Well, thank you all for your input. Thank you for the productive meeting today.
Well, could I just make a future agenda item?
Yes, please.
So, back in June, Laura Healy talked about forests and how healthy forests will play a key in climate change. So I would like to consider putting together, just like Cambridge did, like a forest master plan, and that might help with some of the things that, public spoke about. And we really need to manage our forests and prevent loss of canopy. So I know that's another plan, but I think, as I said, Cambridge did it. I think Brookline has done it. So I think we should kind of focus on that, and that kind of comes under conservation too. So I just think that it's something really important we should be looking into.
Thank you. Great, we got some great ideas tonight for future meetings, and we'll certainly incorporate those into future agendas.
Yeah, and I would say too, if anyone has any suggestions for future topics, just,
Is there a motion to adjourn the meeting? Second? All in favor? Aye. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thanks.